Hello friends, welcome to Sci-Fi Traveler. I'm back with another great science fiction story. In this episode, we'll hear the story of Nova and James. Grab your coffee and sit back. Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. Enjoy the show. The Celestial Court of Aevorn did not do anything quietly. It celebrated with orchestras of instruments that had no earthly names, instruments that played frequencies humans couldn't hear and yet somehow felt in the back of their teeth. It mourned with processions that lasted 3 days and covered 11 kilometers of capital streets, closed for the occasion, and swept by automated drones that were themselves considered ceremonial and had their own dedicated maintenance scroll. It argued through intermediaries and ancient protocol and letters written in inks that changed color with the emotional state of the reader, which made diplomatic correspondence both efficient and deeply embarrassing. Everything the court did, it did with the full weight of 1,000 years pressing down on every gesture, every silence, every footstep on polished marble. Nova had grown up inside all of this and made her peace with it, mostly. She had learned to walk at the exact pace that made crowds part without appearing to expect them to. A difference subtle but important, her mother had explained, between a ruler and a tyrant. She had learned to listen to hour-long diplomatic speeches without letting her expression shift by a millimeter. She had learned, at 14, how to decline a marriage proposal from the eldest son of a Velthari warlord with such gracious precision that the man left convinced the refusal had been his own idea. He had even thanked her on his way out. That last skill had turned out to be the most useful by a considerable distance. The vow she had spoken at her coronation was not unique. Every princess of Aevorn before her had stood before the twin moons and promised the same. She would kneel before no bond, no throne, but her own. Most people imagined it as a sad thing, a cage built from old words. Nova had never understood that reading. The vow felt less like a restriction and more like a description of something she already was. She wasn't avoiding love. She was refusing to be subtracted by someone else's idea of what she was supposed to become in the process of finding it. Her advisors, collectively, were not convinced. "The Velthari delegation is sending their third envoy this cycle," said Liana, Nova's head of protocol, who had perfected the art of delivering bad news in a tone of calm indifference. "He is reportedly a poet as well as a general." "It won't help," said Nova. "I communicated your probable response to their senior attaché. And he said, I am quoting directly, that your ice-cold heart would one day thaw beneath the right warmth." Liana looked up from her data slate. He was very pleased with the metaphor. He used it twice. Nova glanced at the twin moons beginning their rise beyond the tall window. "Tell him the thermodynamics are unsound," she said. "My heart is not ice. Ice melts. I am considerably more durable than ice." Liana made a note. "I will find a diplomatic phrasing." That was the diplomatic phrasing. The summit had been 6 months in the making. 11 delegations from 11 star systems, ostensibly gathered to renegotiate transit rights through the Aevorn corridor, in practice conducting the sprawling informal exchange of alliances and carefully managed offenses that passed for intergalactic diplomacy. Nova had attended 4 such summits before. She understood their structure: formal sessions where nothing was decided, receptions where everything was, and food that was always slightly wrong for everyone because feeding 11 species simultaneously was less a culinary problem than a philosophical crisis without a resolution. She had not expected this one to be different. The human delegation was, by every diplomatic measure, minor. 3 officials, a trade liaison, and 1 xenoarchaeologist invited to document the court's ancient ruins as a gesture of cultural goodwill. The name on the manifest was James. No title. Specialty: pre-collapse stellar civilizations. She had not meant to read anything further, but she had come across his name in a restoration report about the lower archives, and had, without entirely intending to, finished the corresponding paper before setting it aside. The evening reception opened on the great terrace under both moons, the capital spread below in its full, illuminated sprawl. Nova moved through it as she always did, greeting, deflecting, redirecting with practiced ease. The Velthari envoy located her within minutes and mentioned the twin moons before he had finished introducing himself. She complimented the observation and was already moving by the time the metaphor arrived. She was midway across the terrace when she saw him, standing at the far edge, alone, back half turned to the gathering, 2 fingers tracing the carved stone relief of the balustrade, saying something quietly to himself. Not performing disinterest, not positioning for an approach, simply somewhere else in his head, while being physically present at one of the most significant diplomatic gatherings of the decade. Nova stopped. Then, without deciding to, she started walking again. James had not packed the right shoes. This was the first thing he knew with certainty upon arriving at Aevorn's capital, standing in the transit processing bay while a customs drone circled him with the slow, considered thoroughness of a system that had witnessed considerably stranger things than a human carrying 3 field notebooks and a portable spectral analyzer, but remained committed to treating each case as equally worth scrutinizing. The shoes he had brought were practical, built for uneven terrain and unpredictable hours. They were emphatically not designed for polished white marble, which he understood only when the official event briefing materialized on his screen 4 hours before he was expected to appear inside it. He read the dress code twice, then a third time. Then he sent a message to the senior trade liaison, whose name was David, and who had the polished, faintly waterlogged expression of a man who had navigated intergalactic diplomacy long enough to have fully depleted any remaining sense of wonder about the enterprise. The document mentions formal attire appropriate to planetary standing. What does that mean for us, exactly? David's response arrived in under a minute. It means do your best and try not to apologize for it. James considered this. It was not enormously useful as a style guide, but he had completed a 14-month excavation on a moon with 2 competing research teams, seasonal magnetic storms, and a single functional coffee machine that everyone pretended wasn't being rationed. He had worked with considerably less. He had come to Aevorn because of the ruins, not the summit, and this distinction mattered to him and to approximately no one else in his delegation. He was expected to spend his days in the lower archive complexes with a scanner and a notebook, while the actual diplomacy unfolded several floors above him. This suited everyone, including James, who had no particular gift for diplomacy. His department head had noted this once, gently, as a kind of preemptive guidance, and James had received it as an accurate description of himself rather than a criticism. He arrived at the evening reception 11 minutes late because of the portraits. A secondary corridor leading to the terrace was lined with painted portraits of Aevorn's historical court astronomers, each with a small bronze plaque beneath, and James was constitutionally incapable of walking past an unread plaque. 2 of the depicted astronomers had independently mapped star systems his own field used as foundational references. The dates indicated they had done so approximately 6 centuries before human astronomers reached the same coordinates. He made a note, ran out of space, and started a second page. The terrace was lit by both moons, enormous and unhurried in the way of celestial bodies that have never been expected somewhere at a specific time. Several hundred guests moved through the light in the overlapping patterns of people conducting 3 conversations while appearing to have one. Servers circulated with objects that might have been food. James decided to treat this as fieldwork and observe before committing. What drew him immediately, with the reliable speed of something that had always operated faster in him than social calibration, was the stone. The carved relief along the balustrade was a continuous band of extraordinary precision. Narrative at first glance, but the more he looked, the more clearly it resolved into something layered and deliberate. An astronomical chart folded inside a genealogical record. The 2 systems woven together with such care that he couldn't determine whether they were meant to be read in combination or whether the fusion itself was the statement. He traced the 3rd panel with 2 fingers and said quietly, to no one in particular, "That's not decorative." He was aware peripherally that someone nearby had stopped walking. He was aware a moment later that this same person had resumed, now moving toward him. He noted this and returned to the question of the panel, which had a section near the right edge where the notation changed systems entirely, suggesting either a later restoration from a far older source or a deliberate break in chronology that published scholarship had not addressed. "You're muttering," said a voice. He looked up. She was looking at the same section of carving, her expression focused and genuinely attentive in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony. He recognized her the way you recognize something you've studied carefully. Not surprise exactly, but the quiet recalibration that happens when something you've known only as briefing language becomes suddenly, irrevocably present. The twin moons caught the angle of her ears and the careful stillness of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by being watched. "Sorry," he said. "Habit. How far did it carry?" "Not far." "Good." He glanced back at the stone. "This panel switches notation systems midway through. The new register is older by at least 3 centuries if I'm reading it correctly. Either it was added later from an earlier source, or this terrace replaced something significantly older than the official founding record suggests." A short silence. "You're the archaeologist?" she said. "James." "Nova." He looked at her, briefly, honestly, without the careful, neutral glaze of someone performing the act of meeting royalty, then back at the carving, then at her again with the expression of a man running a quiet recalculation. "Should I have started differently?" he asked. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but clearly in the neighborhood. "Most people begin with the moons," she said. "The moons are extraordinary," he agreed, without looking away from the panel. "But they'll be there in an hour. This," he touched the stone, "I genuinely wasn't expecting." She said nothing. When he finally looked over, she was studying the same section he'd indicated, and her expression had shifted, barely but unmistakably, in a direction he hadn't anticipated at all. They stood at the balustrade for 23 minutes. James knew this only because his spectral analyzer, clipped to his jacket pocket, had a timer function he used for fieldwork intervals and had forgotten to disable. Nova knew this because she noticed everything, always, including the exact moment a conversation shifted from polite exchange into something that didn't have a protocol category. The shift happened around the 4th panel. James had moved along the relief slowly, the way he moved through any site that was asking him questions faster than he could answer them. He wasn't performing absorption. He simply was absorbed, and the difference, Nova had decided by the 2nd panel, was plainly visible and unexpectedly difficult to look away from. Most people who wished to appear intelligent in her presence worked noticeably hard at it. James appeared to have forgotten she was royalty, which was either remarkably rude or the most natural thing that had happened to her in 3 summit cycles, and she genuinely could not determine which. "The break here," he said, indicating a seam in the stone almost invisible without close attention, "isn't damage. The edge is too deliberate. Someone made a decision about where one thing ended and something else began." "The official record says that section was always continuous," Nova said. He considered this. "The stone disagrees." "I know," she said. And then, because the words arrived before she could evaluate them, "I've always known." He looked at her with the same direct attention he had given the carving, and she recognized that this was not a performance of interest, but the actual thing, which was somehow both simpler and more difficult to receive than its imitation. "How long?" he asked. "Since I was 11. I used to sit here before formal sessions." The shift in the notation felt like a question no one had written an answer to. She paused. "The court's archivists maintain that the relief is consistent throughout. I stopped raising the point after the 3rd time. That's frustrating." "It was educational," she said. "I learned to read the stone in private." He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who was genuinely thinking rather than preparing a response. She appreciated the distinction more than she could easily explain. "I'd like to run a spectral scan on this section," he said. "It would date the material independently of the record. Not that I'm suggesting the record was falsified," he added, with the mildly careful tone of someone who was in fact gently suggesting the record might have been falsified. "I could authorize access to the lower archives," she said. "The relevant substrate samples are cataloged in the pre-renovation inventory." He looked at her. "That would be... yes. That would be very useful. Thank you." "The archives open at 7th hour," she said. "The eastern lower corridor is the least supervised." I wasn't going to ask how unsupervised it was. "I know," she said. "I told you anyway. Something passed between them that did not have a name in either of their languages, or if it did, neither of them reached for it. The reception continued behind them in all its elaborate orchestration. Someone, she recognized the cadence without turning, was delivering a speech that used the word convergence at least once per sentence. Two Veltari delegates were engaged in what was either a heated argument or a deeply traditional greeting. A server approached with a tray, registered James's expression of polite uncertainty, and withdrew with professional grace. "You should eat something," Nova said. "The gold ones are safe for humans. The triangular ones are not." "What do the triangular ones do?" "Nothing dangerous. 17 minutes of involuntary philosophical introspection." He considered the tray, which had reapproached with characteristic server optimism. "And that's classified as food?" "It's classified as an experience." He took one of the gold ones. "What do these do?" "They taste like something you once ate that you've half forgotten. Different for everyone, apparently." He ate it. She watched him without meaning to. His expression moved through brief surprise, something quieter and slightly unguarded, and then back to ordinary attentiveness, but not before she had seen the middle part. "Warm bread," he said, "which is specific." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask, because some information arranges itself correctly by being left exactly where it lands. The speech behind them concluded to multilingual applause. Liana appeared at Nova's peripheral vision, 8 meters away and closing, with the efficient, non-urgent velocity that meant a scheduling obligation was approaching. Nova was familiar with all of Liana's velocities. This one allowed approximately 4 minutes. "I should go," she said. "The summit," he said. Not a question. "The summit." She turned to face the terrace fully, then looked back once. "The eastern lower corridor, 7th hour." "I'll be there." "Bring your scanner," she said. "The seam extends further than the visible section. I found another break approximately 4 meters past the archive threshold when I was 14. She paused. "I mapped it. I still have the map." The expression on his face in that moment, not impressed exactly, but something honest and unguarded and thoroughly undiplomatic, was something she carried with her through the remaining 2 hours of the reception, through Liana's scheduling summary, through the Velthari envoy's third attempt at a moon metaphor, and well past the point where it should reasonably have faded. It did not fade. Liana walked beside her through the corridor after the reception closed, data slate in hand, running through the following day's obligations with practiced efficiency. She stopped mid-sentence. "You're somewhere else," Liana said. "I'm here," said Nova. Liana looked at her with the expression of someone who had worked in close proximity to this particular person for 11 years and was currently updating several long-held assumptions. "You're somewhere else," she repeated, but politely. Nova said nothing, which was in its own way the loudest thing she had said all evening. The eastern lower corridor smelled like deep time. James had a specific appreciation for this. The particular quality of air in spaces that had been sealed and unsealed repeatedly across centuries, carrying the accumulated atmosphere of every occasion that had ever required their opening. It wasn't unpleasant. It was the smell of something that had been important for a very long time, and had decided to make that clear without being asked. He arrived 12 minutes early, which was not deliberate, but was thoroughly characteristic. His portable spectral analyzer was charged, calibrated, and clipped to his jacket beside a fresh notebook. He had also brought a second notebook as backup, because he had been on enough fieldwork to know that running out of paper at the wrong moment was a category of tragedy too mundane to be forgiven. The corridor itself was extraordinary. The walls continued the relief tradition of the terrace above, but here the carvings were older, less polished, worked in a style that predated formal court aesthetic conventions by at least several generations. The figures were more angular, the astronomical notation denser, and the decisions about what to depict felt less ceremonial and more urgent, as if whoever had made them had been recording something they needed to preserve rather than something they wanted to display. He was 3 meters in and already filling his first page when he heard her footsteps. Nova arrived precisely at 7th hour, carrying a flat case he recognized as archival-grade material storage and wearing the particular expression of someone doing something entirely within their authority, who has nonetheless chosen to do it in a corridor that is, as previously noted, the least supervised. "You found it," she said, looking at his open notebook. The angular shift in the figure style starts exactly at the threshold, he said. Whoever transitioned between the two periods either had access to the original materials or copied them with extraordinary accuracy. The line weight changes here. He indicated a section. And here. But the proportional system is consistent, which means the second artist understood the underlying grammar rather than just the surface appearance. She set the flat case against the wall and opened it. Inside, protected by sealed archival sleeves, were several sheets of a material he didn't immediately recognize. Thin, slightly translucent, covered in careful, hand-drawn notation. "My maps," she said, "from when I was 14. He looked at them. The notation was precise and methodical and showed the systematic thinking of someone who had arrived at their own documentation system through trial rather than instruction. "These are very good," he said, meaning it entirely. "I had a lot of unsupervised time in corridors," she said, which landed somewhere between dry and wistful and didn't fully commit to either. They worked through the morning in the easy, focused rhythm that emerges between two people who share the same quality of attention. She knew the corridor with the unconscious fluency of someone who had memorized it in private over years. He brought external context, comparative data, dating methodology, the accumulated scholarship of a field that had spent considerable time studying civilizations that no longer existed and occasionally finding ones that had simply been missed. Together, they moved along the wall like a slow, unhurried argument being settled in real time. The second seam she had mentioned was exactly where she said it would be. 4 meters past the archive threshold, marked by a change in the stone's compositional character that his scanner confirmed was consistent with a dating gap of no less than 2 centuries. The official founding record places the court at 973 years, he said. "Yes," she said. "This section is older than that." "Yes," she said again, with the quiet patience of someone who had been waiting a long time for the measurement to catch up with the certainty. Which means the founding record describes the moment the court was formalized, not the moment it began." She looked at the wall. There was something here before. Something that chose to continue rather than to start. He wrote this down, then stopped and looked at what he'd written. "Can I quote you in the paper? I'm not a published source." "You found the seam at 14, he said. "You mapped it by hand and preserved the documentation in archival-grade storage. You understood its implication correctly before anyone with a scanner confirmed it. I think that qualifies." She was quiet for a moment. "People don't usually cite me. People are making a methodological error," he said simply, and returned to the wall. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, with an expression that his peripheral vision registered as something requiring attention. But by the time he turned, it had reorganized itself into the composed attentiveness she wore by default. He had noticed already that this reorganization happened quickly. He had also noticed that it happened slightly less quickly each time. They reached the end of the documented section. Beyond it, the corridor continued further than her maps had recorded, and they stood at the uncharted threshold with the particular quality of excitement that exists precisely at the boundary of known and unknown, the feeling that was, in James's experience, the closest thing fieldwork had to offer to what other people described when they used the word joy. "I never went further," she said. "Do you want to?" She looked at the continuation of the corridor, then at the flat case, then at him. "I have a senior diplomatic session in..." She checked the time. 4 hours. "That's 4 hours, he said. "That is 4 hours, she agreed, and picked up her case. The continuation yielded 3 new seams, a section of astronomical notation that matched no published Aevorn record James had in his database, and one entirely inexplicable carving of what appeared to be a very small, very spherical creature that neither of them could identify and that seemed compositionally to date from the oldest stratum of all. "Your ancient ancestors," James said, "apparently considered this important enough to carve in their oldest stone. Perhaps it's symbolic." "Of what?" "I have no idea," she said, "which is unusual." She tilted her head, studying it. "I don't like not knowing things." "Neither do I." It's my favorite part of the job." She laughed. Again, that brief and genuine thing that she made no effort to retrieve once it had escaped. And the sound of it moved through the old corridor and came back from the stone walls carrying something that hadn't been there before. 3 days passed in the way that certain days pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the quality of something being used fully, so that by the end of each one there was nothing left over, no hour unaccounted for, no moment that had simply occurred without being inhabited. James noticed this on the evening of the second day. Nova noticed it on the morning of the first, and said nothing, because noticing something and announcing it were two entirely different decisions. The summit continued above them in its elaborate, self-important way. 11 delegations produced 7 provisional agreements, 3 formal protests, 1 accidental diplomatic incident involving a Velthari envoy and a food item from the wrong category, and an extraordinary amount of documentation that would require 18 months to fully ratify. David sent James 2 messages asking if he was making progress on the archival survey. James replied that he was, which was accurate, and did not add that the survey had expanded considerably beyond its original parameters, which was also accurate and felt like a separate conversation. They had fallen into a rhythm without planning it, which was, James had found, how the best field partnerships always began. Not through coordination, but through the gradual discovery that another person's working habits complemented your own in ways that felt less like accommodation and more like recognition. Nova thought in long structural arcs and had an instinct for what mattered before the evidence arrived to confirm it. James followed evidence with the patient stubbornness of someone who trusted accumulation. Together they were faster than either of them was alone, which neither of them said aloud because stating it would have made it self-conscious and self-consciousness would have made it slower. On the third morning, Nova arrived in the corridor carrying 2 containers of something warm and set one beside him without comment. He tried it. It tasted like strong coffee filtered through something floral that he didn't have a name for and was better than it had any right to be at this hour. "What is this?" he asked. "Arvin brew," she said. "The court serves it at pre-dawn council sessions to maintain consciousness through the 4th hour of procedural argument. So it's medicinal. Technically, it's classified as a ceremonial stimulant. Is there a difference?" "The ceremony," she said, "makes it legal." He drank it and returned to the wall, and she opened her case and took out the maps, and they continued from where they had left off, which happened to be a section of the deeper corridor where the notation shifted into a system neither of them had fully decoded, but that was beginning to yield its internal logic to sustained attention, the way all systems eventually did, if you looked long enough without deciding in advance what you were going to find. It was in the deep section, crouched beside a low-running band of notation that curved with the corridor's slight bend, that she said, not looking up, still tracing the symbol she was studying. "Leanna asked me this morning if I was unwell." "Are you?" he said. "She asked because I was in a good mood before the diplomatic briefing." He considered this. "That's a concerning diagnostic criterion." "She's known me for 11 years, Nova said. "She has data." He looked at her sideways. She was still focused on the notation, but there was something in the line of her expression that was lighter than her default, and had been for 2 days, which he had noticed without mentioning, because some observations were best treated as information rather than conversation starters. "Have you always been," he began, and paused, organizing the question. "Serious?" she offered. "I was going to say thorough." "Thorough is generous." "It's accurate," he said. "Serious isn't a useful word for it. You're not serious for its own sake. You're precise. There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment, and then, "My tutors used the word exacting." "Your tutors were describing themselves," he said, "not you. You found a hidden seam in a 1,000-year-old wall at 14 because it bothered you that the official record was inconsistent. That's not exacting. That's honest." She didn't answer immediately, and he had already returned to the notation before she said, "You are very strange." "You're the second person to tell me that this week," he said. "David told me I was strange for being more excited about this corridor than about a summit that took 6 months to arrange. Are you?" "This corridor is older than the summit's entire frame of reference," he said. "It's not a difficult comparison." She laughed again. And this time she didn't seem to notice that she'd done it, which he had come to understand was the most genuine version of the sound. The ones she noticed arrived already shaped by the awareness of being observed. This one was simply there, briefly, before being replaced by her focused attention on the notation, and he found, as he had found twice before, that the room was different in its wake. It was later that afternoon, in the final hour before she was due in the summit's formal closing session, that they uncovered the chamber. It was not on any map, including hers. It existed behind a section of corridor wall that only revealed itself as a threshold when the spectral analyzer registered a cavity beyond the stone, a narrow gap sealed not with mortar, but with a material his scanner identified as voluntarily applied, meaning someone had closed it deliberately and with care. They stood in front of it for a long moment. "This is going to make me significantly late," Nova said. "We don't have to." "I didn't say I wasn't going to open it," she said. "I said I was going to be late." He looked at her. She was already studying the seal's edge with the focused, unhurried attention she gave everything that mattered, and in the low amber light of the corridor that had been keeping its secrets for centuries, her expression held something he recognized from fieldwork and not from anywhere else. The look of a person standing at the exact threshold of something they had not known they were looking for until it was directly in front of them. He understood it because he was quite certain he was wearing the same expression himself, and was equally certain it had nothing to do with the wall. The chamber exhaled when they opened it, not metaphorically, but literally, a slow release of pressurized atmosphere that had been sealed inside for long enough that its composition was measurably different from the corridor air, older and drier, and carrying a quality that James's instruments could measure and his instincts could not quite name. It was the breath of something that had been waiting patiently and had not, in all that time, grown anxious about it. The room was circular and small, no more than 4 meters across, and every surface was covered. Floor, walls, ceiling, continuous notation, continuous imagery, the same hand throughout, working with a density and intention that made the corridor outside look like a rough draft. In the center, raised on a low plinth of the same stone, was a single object. A sphere approximately the size of a human fist, made of a material that was neither metal nor glass, but held light the way both of them did, with a slow internal luminescence that responded, James noticed, to proximity. Brightening slightly when they stepped closer, dimming when they stepped back, as if it had been designed to know when it was being paid attention to. "I have never," Nova said quietly, "seen this room." "No one has," he said. "The seal was original. Nothing has been in here since the room was closed." She moved slowly along the curved wall, reading. Her expression had shifted into something he hadn't seen before, not her diplomatic composure, not the focused researcher's attention he had come to recognize over 3 days, but something older and less managed, the face of someone receiving information that was reorganizing things. He gave her space and turned to his own section of wall, scanner running, notebook open, moving with the deliberate patience of someone who understood that this kind of moment asked to be inhabited rather than rushed. The notation was not Aevorn court standard. It predated the formal system by enough that several symbols were ancestral forms he recognized only from comparative scholarship, ghosts of meaning that later usage had refined into precision. But the structure was clear enough, and as he worked through it, the shape of the room's purpose assembled itself the way a translation always did, not all at once, but gradually, word by word, until suddenly the sentence was simply there. This was not a vault. It was a record of a decision. "James," Nova said. He looked up. She was standing before a section of wall near the back of the chamber, her flat case open at her feet, her maps spread without her having consciously decided to spread them. Her finger rested on a line of inscription. "Read this," she said. He crossed the room and read it. The inscription described, in the ancestral notation of a civilization that had chosen to call itself a court rather than an empire, specifically because it wanted to remember the difference, the original form of the vow. Not the ceremonial version, The first version, spoken before there was ceremony to contain it, and the first version said something the 1,000 years of subsequent repetition had compressed and, in compressing, had quietly changed. The original vow was not, "I will kneel before no bond." It was, "I will accept no bond that asks me to kneel." The difference was the size of everything. Nova read it twice, and then stood very still in the way of someone whose interior life was moving at considerable speed while their exterior waited for it to catch up. James said nothing, because this was the correct response to watching someone understand something that had been waiting for them for a very long time. "It was never about refusing," she said finally. "No," he said. It was about the terms." She looked at the sphere on the plinth, which had brightened to its maximum when they were both close to it, and was now holding that brightness steadily. "A bond that doesn't ask you to diminish yourself isn't a bond you're kneeling to, it's just a choice, made freely." "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was entirely new, not composed, not managed, not arranged for any observer. And he looked back with the same quality of attention he had given the wall, which was to say his complete and unreserved self, without performance or positioning. "I owe you an explanation," she said, "about something I said on the night we met." "You don't," he said. "I understood it." "You understood it," she repeated. Not quite a question. "You said something true before you decided whether to say it," he said. "It happens in fieldwork sometimes. The evidence arrives before you've made peace with the conclusion. It doesn't make the conclusion wrong." She was quiet for a moment. "I asked you to marry me," she said, "at a diplomatic summit, in front of 11 delegations, 7 minutes after we'd met." 8 minutes, he said. I checked the timer. The sound that came out of her was not the brief, guarded laugh he had catalogued over 3 days. It was something more open and considerably less careful, and it moved through the sealed chamber and came back changed, warmer, as if the room had been waiting for this specific frequency to demonstrate its acoustics. "James," she said, when it had settled. "Nova," he said. "I am not asking because of the court," she said. "I am not asking because of the vow or the summit or what it would mean for anyone other than the two of us. I am asking because I found you at the edge of a terrace talking to a wall, and the wall was more interesting to you than I was, and I found that I cannot." She stopped and started again in the direct, precise way of someone who has decided that accuracy matters more than elegance. "I cannot imagine going back to a life where no one looks at the stone the same way I do." He was quiet for long enough that it might have been concerning. It wasn't, because she had spent 3 days learning the quality of his silences, and this one was not uncertainty. It was care. The care of someone choosing words the way he chose everything, with the patient attention of a person who understood that what you said and what you meant should, wherever possible, be the same thing. "I would need to be based here," he said, "for at least 2 years to complete the archival survey properly. There's enough material in this corridor alone for a monograph. And this chamber," he looked at the glowing sphere, the covered walls, "this is a decade of work." "The court has a research residency program," she said. "I know," he said. "I read the briefing materials on the transit." She stared at him. "You read the residency program details in the summit briefing materials." "I read everything," he said simply. Yes, outside, somewhere in the layers of the court above them, a summit was concluding. 7 provisional agreements were being signed with inks that changed color with the emotional state of the writer, which would make for very interesting archival documents in a century or two. Liana was, with high probability, moving through a corridor at a velocity that communicated escalating professional concern. The twin moons were preparing their nightly crossing of Aevorn's sky, indifferent and magnificent as they had been for 1,000 years and would be for 1,000 more. In the small circular chamber that no one had entered in longer than the court's official record acknowledged its own existence, the sphere on the plinth held its light steadily, and James said yes, and Nova, crown princess of the Celestial Court of Aevorn, keeper of a vow she now understood for the first time, chose freely, which had always, from the very beginning, been exactly the point. There is a vow Nova spoke at her coronation that the court had always understood as a refusal. For 1,000 years, every diplomat, every warlord, every poet general with a moon metaphor ready at the door had heard it the same way. She will not. They had built their strategies around that wall, their proposals against it, their retreats because of it. None of them had read the original inscription. None of them had gone far enough into the dark to find the room where the real words were written. The vow was never "I will not." It was always "I will not be diminished." And that changes everything, not just for Nova, but for the question itself. Because how many walls have we built from vows we never read closely enough? How many refusals are actually conditions, waiting patiently in a sealed room for someone who will go far enough to find them? How many times have we told ourselves we were protecting something when what we were actually doing was standing at the threshold of a dark corridor and deciding not to bring a light? James brought a spectral analyzer and 2 backup notebooks. Nova brought maps she had drawn by hand at 14, in secret, because the official record bothered her and she had not yet learned to stop caring about things that didn't match. They found each other at the edge of a terrace where one of them was supposed to be performing and the other had wandered away to look at the stone, and the stone turned out to be the whole story. We spend so much of our lives at diplomatic receptions, performing the right distance, wearing the right shoes, saying the thing that lands correctly in the room we're standing in. And sometimes, across all that careful management, someone is just standing at the balustrade, talking quietly to a wall, not performing disinterest, not positioning, simply somewhere else in their head, following what actually matters to them, unimpressed by the spectacle. That is, it turns out, the most impressive thing in the room. Nova had been told her whole life that the vow made her untouchable. She discovered, in a corridor that predated the telling, that it had always been an invitation, to be chosen by someone who would not ask her to be less. And James, who had never been particularly gifted at diplomacy and had been told so gently by his department head, turned out to be fluent in the only language that mattered, the language of paying attention to what is actually there, rather than what the official record says should be. The story ends in a small circular room with a glowing sphere and a yes spoken quietly, and 1,000 years of misunderstanding gently, finally, corrected. But the questions it leaves don't end there. They follow you out of the room and into your own corridors, the ones you've memorized, the ones you've stopped walking further down because you ran out of map. What is the original version of the vow you've been keeping? And have you ever gone far enough into the dark to find out what it actually says? Is there someone in your life who looks at the same wall you do and sees the same seam? And if you found them, if they were standing right there at the edge of the terrace, would you recognize them? Or would you be too busy watching the moons? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. The best ones never are. Yes, friends, we've come to the end of another story. I hope you enjoyed it, and before we go, if you liked it, we'd be very happy. Please leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more science fiction stories. See you in the next episode, friends.